Well, we know what makes up the measure of gross domestic product, but is the only real contributor to growth shifts in technology that drive productivity, so we can increase output and push wages higher. Can you expect GDP to grow without that? And is that why the global economy is moving so slowly right now? Have we run out of ideas? Or are perhaps entrepreneurs not getting the funding they need to make changes? We'll look at all of that today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. So what does drive growth in the economy? Well, it depends on how you measure your growth, I guess. But if it's GDP, then you'd need to see an increase in spending, either from the public or from the government, or investment, an improvement in investment, or an improvement in your balance of trade. That's just about it, isn't it, in terms of GDP?
And government spending as well.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying, spending by the public or by the government. Yeah. But that's just a measure, isn't it? It's not really showing causation.
Well, no, and this is one of the whole hassles about the entire area. I mean, GDP is one of these appalling figures. One of my good friends back in Australia, who's a biological researcher called Jeff Davies, made the comment to me a decade ago that economics is the only discipline which adds up its assets and liabilities and calls it wealth. And sorry, you've got to take your liabilities away.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the many problems in actually how you measure GDP. But if you look at the way it's conventionally treated in economic theory, they say it's going to be a change in capital or a change in labour or a change in technology. And of course, for labour, population growth can contribute, and that's seeing all this as driven by the supply side. So more people means more output, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And equally, the argument more improvement in technology means more output. But when you start unpacking it, both of them look very sus, because is it a question of the supply of people, or is it the demand that matters? So is it if you have a completely the sort of non-monetary vision of the economy that neoclassicals have, that really comes from Jean-Baptiste Say, where money is seen as playing no significant role, then supply creates its own demand as the perennial myth of convention.
But for us to spend more, we've got to earn more. And to earn more, then our companies have got to be making
Which comes first, the spending or the expenditure or the income? Okay? And
we've got to have the money coming in to spend.
Yeah, and you've got to, and so you get caught up in a what causes what dilemma. And if you work, the conventional attitude from mainstream economics is if you supply it, they will come. Okay, it's the supply that generates the growth. So if you have an increase in the number of workers, if you have an increase in the number of machines, or the capability of the machines, you'll get an increase in output. But the Keynesian position, and it ends up being really what I call a monetary position, is you don't get income unless somebody's spending. So expenditure comes first.
Yeah.
And therefore the increase in population isn't necessarily going to cause an increase in output, because it won't necessarily bring an increase in expenditure.
Well, yeah, exactly. If you've got an increase in output, not all of that necessarily. 100% increase in output doesn't mean that there's 100% increase in wages. There's going to be profit taken out of that. There's
and also if you produce and it goes to stocks.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember having a conversation with the New Zealand Treasury back when I got blocked by a couple of more than a couple of neoclassicals there, when the Treasury Secretary actually wanted to use my Minsky software to build models of the New Zealand economy.
How did they block you? Were they at the door? Were they sort of
pretty damn close? Pretty damn close. So they could have tackled me and thrown me in the bin.
Steve Keen's trying to get in the building. Let's all get downstairs.
Exactly. But when I was talking to one of them and giving a presentation, he said, "Look, I look out the door. I look out the window and I see equilibrium." And my comment was, "Well, so you walk past car yards that are empty every night, do you?" And he went, "What?" And I said, well, if you're right, if everything sells in a spot market, so supply equals demand in a spot market all the time, then there would be no stocks left over at the end of the day. Everything would be sold. So do you walk past empty car yards at night? And he really couldn't comprehend my comment. I mean, this is how locked in they are to seeing equilibrium everywhere.
Well, they might have got the supplies in for the next day, of course. But
no, even on that front,
nothing happens instantaneously.
But that's economic theory happens instantaneously, and that's the problem. So you've got to go back and say what actually causes the growth. Is it the creation of new physical resources, or is it expenditure? And what we're seeing after the financial crisis is that expenditure is low. What happens? Well, GDP is low as well.
Yeah. And
what then the mainstream way of explaining that is to blame what they call secular stagnation. This was something a vampire, a zombie idea from Alvin Hansen in 1934 and 1937 that Summers resurrected to try to explain why the low growth had occurred. And if you look at it, I paraphrase the argument that its weaknesses on the supply side that have caused the low growth after the crisis as saying, the whole problem with the economy is parents aren't having enough kids and engineers aren't having enough ideas. Now, parents aren't having enough kids, yeah, that's true. There has been a decline in population growth in most of the OECD. But engineers not having enough ideas, when we're watching rockets land on their backsides and electric cars and solar technology and wind technology and talk of
it's unlikely that they're all en masse saying, I'm bored, I don't want to do this anymore.
The ideas aren't being funded. They're not being funded. They're not being turned into reality.
But are those ideas, though, the only, getting back to the original question, only thing that's driving? Because Robert Solow, an economist back in the 1950s, said 80% of the growth in US productivity improvements came from technological progress, which sort of seems obvious.
No, it actually was a failing of neoclassical theory of growth that led to that result, because you had what's called the Cobb-Douglas production function invented by Cobb. I think Cobb was the mathematician and Douglas was the economist, and the mathematician proposed this little function saying output is a function of labour and capital multiplied together. So you multiply labour by capital, and you raise them both to an exponent. You multiply them by 1 to the power of alpha, which might be, say, 0.3, and the other 1 minus alpha, which is therefore 0.7, so that if you ever double both labour and capital, you double output. It's an idea of constant returns to scale. And that makes plenty of sense. At a particular point in time, if you have twice as many factories with twice as many workers, you'll get twice as much output. So that's a realistic thing. But in putting it together, they found a perfect fit to the yearly data they had on GDP in America at the time. Very high correlation coefficient, and that convinced them to make it think, well, it must be a realistic model in that case. And initially, they just had a constant multiplied by L to the alpha times K to the 1 minus alpha. Now, over time, what Solow did is, well, let's break this down into a growth equation. So you have output, which is, to use the simple y, is equal to L to the alpha times K to the 1 minus alpha, and that's giving your output. If you want to see rate of change, then you have rate of change of y divided by y, percentage rate of change. And
I hope people have got a pen and paper handy.
I'm sorry about that, but it's happened to be talked to me. And he had a percentage rate of growth of labour and a percentage rate of capital, and that only explained 15% of the variation in the change in income. Right. So they had to add in a technology term, which they use capital A for, and so that's got to be what they call, it's not disembodied technical progress, but total factor productivity. And that explained 85% of the change in output. Now, that's where they've been stuck.
But aside from all those equations, isn't it a bit obvious that if you've got the same number of people doing the same amount of stuff, the only way you're going to improve that growth is either per head. Throw more people at it, but otherwise per head. The only way is going to be through innovation, which is going to be using the same energy more efficiently.
Well, you've used the magic word, energy, because when you looked at what total factor productivity was, just given the fact that you've got labour raised to one power and times capital to another, and then you've got output on the other side, and just output on its own, not output raised to some power, then that A term had to have this really weird dimensionality, and nobody could make head or tail of it. And simply they said, well, total factor productivity, and that looks like labour productivity. So we say it's increasing productivity of labour and capital together. That's what they call it, total factor, labour and capital together.
But of course that is going to change as machines change, as machines become more efficient. So we'll talk about that in the full version of this podcast. If you want to listen to it, then you need to subscribe. You can do that at debunkingeconomics.com or by becoming a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. You can hear this podcast in full and all the other ones in this series as well. We might throw an extra one in this week to talk more about the coronavirus as well and make that available to everybody. So we'll catch you later on in the week for that one. For now, though, I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Thanks for listening.